So good afternoon, everyone. For those of you that are joining us for part two, that were in part one, welcome back. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, welcome. It's nice to have everyone here, although it's 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. I think everybody's probably had a long week, so we are hoping to make the next hour and 15 minutes fun and interactive, and we're really hoping for a lot of audience participation. So to get us started today, before I introduce our expert panelists, I want to actually start by introducing the person who is the reason why we're all in this room, in this virtual room, who is the reason why we were all in part one earlier this afternoon, Dr. Victoria Williams. I'm going to ask her to put on her camera so we can all see Vicky, if that's okay.
Hi, everyone.
So Dr. Victoria Williams is very modest, but she's put so much time and effort into making this webinar series a reality. Now, Vicky, keep your video on just so we can see you. We just had Women's Day in South Africa on Monday. That's a public holiday, as we know, and I guess this is the second Women's Day celebration, especially celebrating women in the sciences, and more specifically, women in the neurosciences, which is exactly what Vicky is. So Dr. Victoria Williams is a neuroscientist. She has a really diverse and interesting background. Right now, she's a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Psychology at WITS, looking at executive functioning and working memory, and working with some new exciting techniques in EEG and ERP related research. But her background actually starts off in anthropology. So she's done some really interesting anthropological work and that looked at the evolution of the human brain, which led her to do a PhD in anatomy at WITS. Before that, she was at UJ for a little bit as well, and now coming to psychology, which really just shows how capable Vicky is in terms of understanding and researching the brain from so many different disciplines. She's also the mother of 2 young children, so she does all of this with having 2 young kids at home. So welcome, Vicky. Vicky was coordinating part 1. I'm hoping that she'll also help me with part 2. I don't think I can do such a good job as Vicky, so I'm hoping that she'll come in with her input and that she'll also answer some of the questions, and also informally, please be a part of our panel today. And just a very, very big thank you again to Vicky for all of the amazing work she has done, especially behind the scenes, to get us all together and to really celebrate the amazing women we have today that will surely inspire the next generation of neuroscience researchers. So a virtual round of applause to Vicky.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Saba.
Of course, no, thank you. So to get us started, to introduce the rest of the panel, we're going to start with a neuropsychologist that's been in the field for more than 20 years, Professor Nafisa Kasimje. And I know I've said her surname wrong, and she'll please forgive me for this. I'll ask Nafisa to just put on camera for the introduction, if that's okay. So Nafisa is a professor of psychology in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Pretoria, where she obtained her PhD. She is very good at juggling different things, because she's not only an excellent researcher and teaches neuropsychology, psychopathology and neuropsychological assessment, she's also a practitioner, a clinician, and she does some really interesting kind of research and clinical work on deep brain stimulation and in the treatment of Parkinson's disease and other psychiatric disorders. So it is a pleasure to have you here today, Nafisa, and we're really excited to hear about your experience in the field, especially in South Africa. Oh, I had a Zoom. Hopefully it didn't interrupt the session. Thank you, Professor, for being here today. So we have Dr. Busi Maseko joining us, who is a neuroscientist, currently based at WITS. I'll wait for Busi's camera to come on just so you can put a name to the introduction. Thank you, Busi. Hi. So she actually comes from Tembisa. So she's local from Johannesburg, and she is the mother of an autistic child, which I think has been a lot of the inspiration for her research in autism that she'll hopefully tell us more about in the next hour or so. She does really groundbreaking research in autism in South Africa, but she's also received training abroad. So she went to the University of California, where she she went to a specific institute that focused on autism research in humans. She's an expert anatomist, by the way. I think many people here, including people on this panel, have been taught by Busi, and we heard a lot about her in our part one as well. What you might not know is that she also has recently established an NGO called the Kinu Autism Foundation that aspires to raise awareness about autism in South Africa, as well as improve the quality of life for individuals with autism and their families. So a very warm welcome to you, Busi. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Saba.
So we have another neuropsychologist at our panel, Dr. Shoda Frazier. There's Shoda. Hi, Shoda. So she is a specialist neuropsychologist, and she actually holds a dual registration in both clinical neuropsychology and clinical psychology. She also recently completed her PhD at WITS, looking at neuropsychological rehabilitation, specifically in rehabilitation of working memory deficits in children and in adolescents. She is an honorary academic at the University of the Witwatersrand, where she lectures on neuropsychology in the School of Medicine in the Department of Neuroscience. She's worked across the Johannesburg hospitals circuit. So she has loads of clinical experience that I'm sure she'll share with us today. More recently, she has turned into private practice. So from part one, I know there's a lot of interest in the clinical neurosciences. So looking forward to hearing from you, Shona, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Saz.
So we're lucky today to have a neuroanatomist joining us, Dr. Sharika Odendaal. I'll wait for her to put on her video too. Hi, Sharika. So Sharika also has a really interesting background. So she started off her journey in geology and archaeology, and she has lots of different degrees. So she has a degree in biology, and then she went into the health sciences and has degrees in physiology. She has an honors in anatomy, and she eventually did her PhD at WITS. She is currently a lecturer that focuses on analyzing the variable and emergences of different courses of cochlear nerves, of the cochlear nerve. So we're hoping to hear more about your really interesting research, and also the interdisciplinary way that you actually came into the neurosciences. That is really, really fascinating. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
So last but certainly not least, we have a French and, dare I say, also South African paleo-neurologist joining us today, Dr. Emily Van Again, I'm not saying it properly, but I'm trying. Thank you for joining us here today, Emily. My French isn't very good, but she's a lecturer in human origins in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge. And she also has a really interesting and varied background. She started her research on African fossil records in France, but then for her postdoctoral research, she came to South Africa. So she came to South Africa to kind of explore this area of the evolution of the human brain more. She first started at the University of Pretoria, and then she came to WITS and worked quite closely with people doing research at the cradle of humankind, I believe. And last year, she moved to Cambridge in the UK, where she lectures about human evolution and on the evolution of the human brain. But I believe she also has really close links still to South Africa and a lot of local collaborators. So thank you so much for joining us. I will say I'm very jealous of the short sleeves. A very warm welcome to you, Emily.
Thank you.
So now that you know a little bit more about our expert panel, just to give you an overview of how we'll be approaching this webinar, I'll be just asking a few questions, and the panelists will of course answer them and offer their insights. But please feel free to ask questions on the chat or on the Q&A. I think the success of this afternoon also really rests on audience participation. So we really, really are excited to hear more from the students and from the early emerging neuroscientists in this group. So to start us off, as we could tell from the bios that we just read and from getting to know all of you a little bit, everybody has a really diverse background, and it seems like they came into neuroscience from different ways, different avenues. But what first interested you in studying the brain? What was it that really attracted you to neuroscience or to the study of the brain? Everyone's shy. All right, so we're going to hear from Vicky first, and then we'll move it over to Nafisa. Thank you, guys. Thank you both.
Thanks, Sabs. So yeah, my interest in the brain, it kind of happened very much coincidentally. It was during my my postgrad studies. I started my master's in archaeology. So I'm similar to Sash. I also have an archaeology background. So I did my master's it was kind of an interdisciplinary master's where I integrated neuropsychology with archaeology. And my supervisor at the time was very big into brain evolution and trying to understand the Stone Age mind, and Professor Marlies Lombard. So she got me very into the neurosciences. And since then, I've just been fascinated by the brain, basically. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you for sharing. Nafisa, over to you.
Thank you, Sabah. I started my undergrad doing a Bachelor of Accounting degree, and I took psychology as an elective because of my general interest in it. And I was very fortunate that the year I took the psychology elective, Professor Theo Lazarus had returned from UCLA, and he lectured a module called neuropsychology. And it just seemed to be so intriguing and fascinating. And I think somewhere along the line, I realized that the computational part of accounting and my fascination with psychology just made sense to my young mind, that I wanted to do something with looking at the relationships between brain and behavior. So much to my parents' consternation, I switched over from the Bachelor of Accounting to a BA in psychology. And for the rest of the time, I've always followed that interest, trying to find a way to get to the point of neuropsychology. And in the 80s, neuropsychology or neuroscience in general was not a field that was very open to anyone, and particularly to a young person like me, and a woman of color as well. But I have to say that coming from the University of Durban-Westville, the one thing we did get taught as part of our courses, because it was at the height of the political unrest, was using your resourcefulness and your resilience to eventually get to where you want to be.
Thank you, Nafisa. That's so fascinating. I've actually never heard of somebody starting off with an accounting degree, but you're right. It gives you like that, an ability to like compute numbers is a really big part of what we do in research for the quantitative element of neuroscience research, and also about your personal struggles, right? In terms of finding a place for yourself in a field that was very obscure in South Africa, and in some ways is still kind of trying to come out of that obscurity right now. Thank you for sharing. Can we hear from a few more of the panelists about how their interest in studying the brain came about? Yes, Lucy.
Hi,
and then
Sabah.
Emily.
For myself, it was just always a fascination. I mean, I didn't really have any reason beyond just interest, just fascination with the brain. It's the most complicated, most beautiful machine ever designed. And I, ever since I was very small, I thought I wanted to become a psychiatrist, but it wasn't so much about the psychiatry. It was really about trying to understand the workings and the design, of the brain. And ironically enough, when I was doing my science degree, I started to have, a real strict neuroanatomy course when I was in second year, and I did not understand a word. So I completely failed my neuroanatomy that first year. It was really horrible, and I could barely even understand, the lecturer. And it just became kind of a personal challenge, that I'm really going to master this. So the second time that, unfortunately, of course, I had to repeat it, But the second time I really did master the subject. And that's when I actually met the person who would later become my PhD supervisor, who I was very lucky that in the year that I was repeating it, he was just arriving in South Africa, and he taught with a passion, and he's so interested and just knows everything about the brain. And I just loved listening to him, so that's where, that kind of fascination was really strengthened for me. And from then on, it was really about just trying to pursue this neuroanatomy. I didn't know that I wanted to do autism research specifically at the time, but it was all about just the brain, whether it's animal brains and human brains and so on. But the more mature, I became as a student, the more I realized that it's more of the clinical neuroanatomy that I'm interested in. And then eventually I discovered that my ultimate passion then is autism research.
Lucy, can I ask, was that person Professor Paul Mango?
Yes, yes, very much so.
It's good. Don't be shy to mention the names. We heard
He's a
about
superstar.
Paul. Actually.
Yeah,
He
really is a superstar in my book. Yeah.
Even though he's not a female neuroscientist, maybe he can be an honorary one.
He's really special. He's very special. Of course, he's not a female, but I can promise you there are so many female neuroanatomists right now walking, and working in the world because they've been through, his hands. He really does do his bit, so to speak, in terms of uplifting people, women, people of color, and so on. He really is an amazing guy. Yeah.
If you could see in the chat, somebody just wrote that you were my Dr. Paul Mango, which is such a nice thing.
So awesome. Thank you. That's amazing. That's really amazing. That is a high compliment right there.
And it's a tribute to Paul as well, and we'll tell him, we'll write him after this as well, that you're only as good as your students. So because so just to go back, so a good mentor and a good teacher makes excellent the next generation, right? They build the next generation. So thank you so much for sharing with me. So just before we pass it over to Emily, just to say, just because you failed a neuroanatomy course doesn't mean then you can't become a neuroanatomist, right? So don't get discouraged from all of us, if it's statistics, if it's neuroanatomy, if it's computational modeling, don't get discouraged if you fail the first time. It's meant to be hard. Just keep going and you'll just get better, and you'll and you have a living example of the standards of excellence you can reach, even if you initially fail. So.
Absolutely. I was an A student the second time round, so it helped. Yeah, it helps.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Over to you, Emily.
Well, it's very interesting for me to hear all of the discussion about how we became passionate about brain, because I never really thought about that. But I think during my PhD, what was really the moment I realized that the brain was so important is when I was trying to answer big questions in human evolution. So how did our ancestors could evolve or cope with changes in the environment, how they could make tools or even develop language or these kind of things. And then at that point, I realized that probably the only way we can get the answers is to study the brain, because it's really the brain is the interface between us and the environment. And this is how we can really understand how we evolve and how the way we are today as humans. So I think it's really at that point during my PhD that I thought I should study the brain. But then the challenge was that in the fossil record, you can't find brain, fossilized brain. So I think that's why also I was particularly interested in the brain and human evolution, is that you have to develop very new techniques if you want to reconstruct human brain evolution. So I think that was part of the thing, there was a big challenge behind. And when I moved to South Africa for my first postdoc, I was in the Department of Anatomy in Pretoria. And then I developed collaboration with colleagues there. They were anatomists, and they could really also explain to me how the human brain is so complex, and that there were so many things also to study, not only in the fossil record, but also in extant humans, how the brain is organized and the functions and everything. So I think it's really at that moment that I think for me, it was clear that I had to study the brain to understand our origins.
Thank you, Emily. I find the link with archaeology just fascinating, really just fascinating. And I think it's going to be, there's going to be more and more research looking at the evolution of the brain from that perspective. Before we pass on the question to the others, could I ask a very ignorant question? I should know this, but just a question. Do you find fossils of the skull? Do you have fossil, or is it so? And then you reconstructed based on the skulls as well?
Yes, it's exactly that. Like we use the brain case and the imprints of the brain that are preserved in the inner surface of the brain case. And it's the only way we can really collect information. And that's why we still have so many questions about brain evolution that we can't directly access the brain and say, okay, look, it's like this. So we have to develop like techniques in like imaging, like MRIs or CT scans, or everything we use in hospital today, we use them for the
3D printing. Yeah, 3D
exactly.
printing of the brain, and
yeah.
I think we should have a whole other webinar on methods of studying the brain. But thank you so much for sharing, Emily. That's fascinating. Are there other comments on this question on inspirations and the inspiration that really drove you towards studying the brain from our other panelists? Hi, Shoda.
So I also just want to Hi, I want to echo what Emily was saying now, how it's so interesting to hear the different ways that people get into the neurosciences. It's really just fascinating. For me, I suppose the initial motivation was more, I come from a family where there are a couple of neurologists, and so I always thought that the brain itself was very interesting, but I certainly didn't want to become a neurologist, and then I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I ended up actually just doing a general BA at Wits, and for my undergraduate. And then I started, and one of my subjects was psychology, and we started doing a course, I think it was in third year, on cognitive neuroscience, which then went on into honors. And I just found that so fascinating, that like interface between the mind and the brain, and how actually it's very difficult to understand the mind without having some kind of understanding of the brain. And I was fortunate, I think, in terms of timing, that the year that I did my honors, the next year after that was the first time that Wits ran a master's in neuropsychology, which I got into. And it was there actually that I was taught by Prof. Kassenji. But I did, that was sort of my first experience of neuropsychological assessment as part of our learning. And I was so interested in cognition and neuropsych assessment. And I did my master's in working memory specifically with HIV children. But it was really during this time, and then onto my PhD with my same supervisor, Prof. Kate Cockcroft, who I also absolutely still adore. And she encouraged me to look at rehabilitation specifically, because I think at that stage the idea of neuroplasticity was relatively new. I suppose not the idea of neuroplasticity was new, but the idea that we could do something with that neuroplasticity, and looking at things like cognitive training and neuropsychological rehabilitation. And I had been volunteering at Headway at that stage for I think about 10 years. And so I was really interested in creating sort of a more neuropsychological rehabilitation group. And that was where my interest then went. So having an understanding of the anatomy, and then having an understanding of the cognition and the mind, so the embodied brain and the embodied mind, and then how we can use that knowledge in order to be able to rehabilitate damaged or compromised circuits.
That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing, Shona. It's so nice to see the progression of how you first got inspired and then how your research interests have actually changed over time, also depending on who you were lucky enough to work with through these many inspiring lecturers and researchers. So before we move on to the next question, yes, I'm eager. I'm eager to hear the last response. Over to you, Sharika.
Hi. Hi, everyone. So I actually took the very scenic route to become a neuroanatomist. I started off doing geology. So I started off in the geological sciences, and like Vicky, I did archaeology. And I started getting fascinated in the evolution of how the human species came about. And through anatomy, Pussy was actually one of my lectures in anatomy. And yeah, so through that, I started getting more interested in the way the brain works and the different structures and the evolution of how it came about. And then I went through Prof. Manga's hands as well with my honors and ended up doing my PhD through him as well. So yes, Boosie and Prof. Manga were also my inspirations.
I think it's so nice to hear that your teaching and your supervision work don't go unnoticed. Don't go unnoticed. It's so nice to hear how many people that have been a part of the panel in this room, or that are here now, or that were in the first part of this webinar, or that are associated with people in these panels, have just been such an inspiration to established researchers now, but also probably a lot of the students and emerging researchers that are participating today. So you've in a way already answered this question, but a question I think a lot of the participants might have that came up in part one is, what do you study to become a neuroscientist? And so we've heard that. I think one answer is that you can study almost anything, right? Because a lot of disciplines fall into this really broad, overarching and interdisciplinary category of the neurosciences. But from your experience, because it is also a practical question, I think some of the participants here, and they'll maybe share with us as well, the backgrounds, it'd be nice to hear the backgrounds that they're coming from. I think some of them are psychology students, some of them are BSc or MSc students, but what would you advise? So what would you actually study? And you could even mention what you studied. A lot of you have already said that already. So from accounting to psychology to geology, but what would you really study? What degrees would you pursue to develop a career in the neurosciences, like as a general background, since there aren't that many degrees that actually have neuroscience in the name? So there is an honors now in WIT that's an honors in neuroscience. Sometimes you can do, a master's in neuropsychology, but there's especially in South Africa, there's very few degrees that actually that say neuroscience, right? So it could be quite confusing for students to kind of choose what they should study to kind of help them establish a career in some aspect of the neurosciences.
So I think, in the South African context, it's a sort of a newer thing. And so it's sort of it's a little bit more unconventional doing the neurosciences. There are a number of different avenues, as you've heard, you can go. The one, so I started off in humanities at UJ. I think Saba mentioned that. And I majored in psychology and anthropology. And from that, I then, in my honors, I actually did my honors on, I love animals a lot. So I did animal-assisted therapy. I wanted to see the impact that animal-assisted therapy had on the elderly at old age homes. So that was from an anthropological perspective. So that was my honors. And then when I started my master's, that was still in humanities at UJ, and that was in anthropology. And that was when my first sort of real understanding of this interdisciplinary research kind of emerged. So that was when I integrated the neuropsychology. So one of my co-supervisors is a professor, was Professor Alban Burke. He's very well known in neuropsychology. And so yes, he was part of my master's. He was my co-supervisor. And then of course, Professor Marlies Lombard, who's more of a cognitive archaeologist. And from that, when I finished my master's, I then thought, okay, well, I love the brain, but I want to have a better understanding of the anatomy, because I understood like the brain in a way that it was quite a superficial understanding. To a certain extent, I understood how one's environment is very important to the brain and how it's evolved across time and space, but I didn't really understand the deep anatomy. And so I think a lot of people think at the time, and even looking back, think, oh, that was quite a jump. But I actually emailed, so I emailed Professor Paul Manger with my research idea. And I was like, I have no background in anatomy. I have no background in the medical field at all. Please, can I do my PhD with you in brain anatomy? And I had a suggestion of looking at non-human primates because, you know, they're the closest to humans phylogenetically. And he agreed to supervise me. So I was very happy. But at the same time, as Busi mentioned, you know, the brain is incredibly complex, and I didn't really at the time realize how complex it really is. And I spent many nights looking at brain atlases and really trying to understand anatomy. I went to brain dissections and whatever I could to really try and understand it. And I really feel like I've come out of it richer for it. And I'm so appreciative also to Paul for everything. And yeah, it's just been the most incredible opportunity. And now I'm in psychology with Saba, and I'm doing my postdoctoral research in psychology. So again, I've changed disciplines. So it is one of those things that it is very interdisciplinary. And my suggestion would be at an undergraduate level to kind of think about the kind of research within neurosciences you're interested in. And of course, one only finds out through time and experience, you know. So my suggestion would be maybe trying to be involved in some of the more practical things, you know, going to the medical school and seeing what's involved in the dissections, you know, try to find a mentor to assist you, going to the psychology departments, you know, reaching out to that's neural, you know, about some kind of job shadowing and getting some experience, you know, practical understanding of what's involved. And yeah, and then in your postgrad, you can kind of take it further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shoki. Well, while we wait for some of the other panelists to share a little bit on their thoughts on this, what I've taken away from what Vicky said is that, you know, you can start off anywhere almost. Like you'll probably have some lecture in one of the disciplines around the brain, and you'll be guided for your future studies based on your interests, right? So based on your research interests, based on also people that you come across. And I think from what Vicky was sharing is don't be scared to change around. So if you started off in the humanities, there's nothing stopping you from then moving to the health sciences for your honors, or maybe then going to archaeology for your PhD. So it's also to challenge yourself, I guess, also to move across disciplines, but really guided by your interests, guiding in what really interests you about the brain. Like I said, neuroscience is such a big topic. There's so much to focus on. I see a really interesting question in the chat, but I'll wait to see. Are there any other thoughts on your experience and what you studied to become a neuroscientist, or what you would also advise students that are interested in kind of building a career in one of the aspects of neuroscience? Shona?
Yes, I just also wanted to say that because neuroscience is such a huge topic, I think you can start from anywhere. And you know, I started in the humanities departments, and now I work for health sciences. But it was just that the neurosciences are so encouraged in humanities, and even, you know, I initially started to work as a clinical psychologist before I began working as a neuropsychologist in the government sector. And neuroscience is such an area of interest at the moment that actually it's such a wonderful time to become a part of neuroscience, because it is encouraged. And, you know, things like Wits Neural is such a wonderful way to keep up to date with what's going on in the different disciplines. But also echoing what Vicky said as well, going to anatomy dissection school that Wits offers was amazing for me, and it was unbelievable to learn about anatomy on that level. But it was very encouraged by my lecturers at the time, and I think it's such an exciting period to be getting involved in neuroscience in South Africa. because it's relatively new and because it's relatively dynamic, that you can come at it from different directions depending on what you are interested in. And, you know, as somebody that started out doing a general BA to land up here, it just shows that the kind of trajectory that you go on can be very dynamic and very flexible. But that my experience has been that it has been very, very encouraged in the humanities department and specifically in the psychology department as well.
Thanks, Joan. That's actually true. I didn't think of it, that you've jumped from humanities and now you're actually based in the health sciences, which just shows you that, like, yeah, you can move around, and that's actually good. Challenge yourself to move around, to learn something outside of your discipline. And I think that's also what's being done in the research world. Good research now involves interdisciplinary collaboration. So interdisciplinary studying for students of neurosciences is probably also really, really needed to be able to become an effective teacher and to become an effective researcher. Are there any other thoughts on that question before I move to the, yeah, Nafisa and Busi? We'll first move to Nafisa and then Busi. Thank you both.
Thank you, Sabah. I think because of the interdisciplinary nature, I agree with the other panelists that you can start off in one area because that was your interest, but I think the thing would be that it's such a dynamic field and there's so many resources out there, including online resources, that you can keep your exposure to all these different things and your interests will develop, and you can cultivate different ways to almost utilize them both in clinical work as well as in research work. I started out with a research degree, so I qualified as a research psychologist under Prof. Dev Grissel, who was the only practicing neuropsychologist at that time in the 90s. And then through my mentor, Professor Linda Richter, I went to the University of Michigan, where I got exposed to clinical neuroscience. And when I returned, I did a PhD in neurodegenerative disorders, but I felt that there was a part of the clinical aspect that was missing. So then I did a master's in counseling psychology, which helped me both in therapeutic work with patients with neurodegenerative disorders. And all in that while following up with many online courses and contact courses like the WITS and neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, and other neuropsychology courses. So in the end, I'm now a neuropsychologist as well, but there's never a day in the work that I do on a daily basis where my research psychology, my counseling psychology, and as well as my, the exposure to neuropsychology doesn't all come together because the field is so dynamic. There's different research interests out there, and you can utilize all of those generalist skills to be able to eventually decide what is it that really piques your interest at a specific time. And just keep in mind that that will keep changing. And thankfully, there's so much happening in the fields that you can always find a space in which you can explore all these intriguing things about the brain and behavior relationships.
I'm learning so much from you about your background, Nafisa. That's incredible, the amount of training. And I think it's also really a good example that you can keep on studying. Just because you have a PhD or you have one master's in a particular area doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep on challenging ourselves to know more. And just to say that it sounds that Nafisa's really worked with some of the pioneering psychologists and neuropsychologists. I think Dev Grissel was one of the first kind of neuropsychologists in South Africa. Linda Richter is still at WITS. She's a distinguished professor in developmental psychology. So it's great to hear about your really diverse background and how it all kind of comes together in your current practice. Thank you for sharing, Nafisa. Over to Busi.
Yeah, I would have to agree with everyone. I think there are certainly things that you can do to kind of prepare yourself beforehand, because you might have an interest, for example, in neuroscience, but not really sure where exactly you want to go. So you want to kind of educate yourself about, what are the different angles, in which you can go. So neuropsychology, what does that entail? Go find out where, for example, in the university where you are, where is that housed, right? And go and speak to the people who are actually working there. Who are the lecturers? Who are the senior lecturers there? Who's doing research there? And what type of research are they doing? Just get a kind of an appreciation of what do they dabble in and what are the boundaries of what they do. And if you want to do, for example, something like neurophysiology, neuroanatomy, go and see, a couple of people, a couple of my postgraduate students I met because they just wandered into my office one day. They were knocking on every door, literally knocking on every door and just finding out, what do you do? I wanna do neuroanatomy. What do you do? And they just happen to be more interested in what I say, but they still go around and they find out from all the colleagues, and then they decide, it's really the best thing to do. And also, if you inquire about this when you are, for example, in second year, like in your undergraduate, years, second, third year, you can then have an idea of how you can arm yourself. So if for example, you're coming from a BA degree and you don't have any anatomy and you know that you want to do neuroanatomy, then that means that there's some extra learning that you're going to have to do, like Vicky mentioned earlier. So, like when Vicky went to those dissections and stuff, nobody nobody invited her. She had to kind of push her way in. And that's what you have to do. You have to push for yourself. You have to go and see, when are they dissecting the brain? Can I go and see what does it actually look like? Am I actually really interested in this? And that gives you the time to also really think about whether you want, whether this is the kind of thing you want to spend 3 years of your life really investigating. That really helps. And of course, yes, joining all of these associations that I see in the chat here for sure. And I see that question about the networking. Yes, of course. A lot of connections that I have are just from networking. You meet people who sometimes are not really interesting in terms of what you're doing, but they know somebody else. There's always somebody else that they know who can be helpful. That's already happened between myself and you, Saba, in this very at the beginning of this seminar. So that is absolute gold. That's how we learn more things. That's how we meet our next collaborators. That's how we meet our next partners. It's absolutely crucial. And yes, of course, we can do everything. I'm listening to everyone, I'm listening to the panelists, and I'm imagining all kinds of things that I can do with them. I've already checked everyone out, and I'm thinking, what else can we do? What questions can we answer together? What can we explore together? It's what we do. It's what actually gives us, the work that we do every day. Without networking, this would not be possible. And thank goodness for the internet, right? So, now you don't even need to go knocking on doors. Just find email addresses, just join the associations, go to websites like school websites, university websites, copy and paste email addresses and ask people, what are you doing? What are you up to? Would you be interested in telling me about that? Can I come and visit you? Can we have a meeting? These days you can Zoom, Teams, whatever, and just find out what they're doing and just check it out for yourself before it's actually time to commit yourself.
Thank you, Busi, and thank you for starting to answer this really important question. And I wonder if the other panelists also have some inputs about how do we actually network? So we have some practical suggestions. So knocking on doors when we're allowed to knock on doors, searching websites, looking for people, putting yourself out there, emailing. Just write a nice email. Always start off by addressing them as professor to be safe. And don't get discouraged if people don't email, or don't be shy to email back. Don't be shy to email again. Academics often have lots of emails. But also as a part of that question, it relates to social anxiety. So as students, sometimes even as emerging researchers, you feel bad writing someone, or you don't know how to address an email properly, or you just feel too intimidated by that person to actually speak to them or to knock on their door. So there's probably other kind of struggles with networking as well. Do you have any experiences, and this is for the panelists, that you'd like to share in terms of trying to develop the courage to write those emails, to knock on those doors? I don't think you need much courage to explore websites, but you need to have the motivation to explore websites. It'd be really nice to hear from you. Sharika?
I think I can answer a bit more about the social anxiety aspect. So I have had still do have really bad social anxiety, like to the point where I couldn't even get up and stand up in front of my class in school and do an oral speech. I had to do it like one-on-one with the teacher. So naturally, lecturing was not the first choice. But yeah, in order to get over any kind of social anxiety, you're just going to have to put yourself out there. Unfortunately, there's no other way to do that. You just have to take it one step at a time and make the choice to just overcome it, I suppose. And the only real way you can actually network is by putting yourself out there. And in any kind of research, like everybody has been saying, the only way you can actually get to know what else is out there is by networking with people, by joining webinars, by going to meetings, by just speaking with people about it. And so the only real way to do that is to just put yourself out there, unfortunately.
That's really good advice. And I have to say, I still struggle with social anxiety. It might not look like it, but I really do. And I think it comes to self-confidence, right? Like, so if you know, we all have insecurities, and it's hard to do it, especially asking questions. I never used to ask questions in lectures, never used to ask questions in seminars. I was always like at the back. I was a little bit scared. But as soon as I started to do it, it got easier. And I think it's the same thing with networking. As soon as you start writing those emails, you know, and you get some positive feedback, you're more likely to keep on going. So just make the initial first step, and don't just get discouraged if you don't receive an email back, or if you didn't get positive feedback. Just, it gets better with time from my side at least. I'm gonna pass it over to Vicky to share a little bit, and then back to Busi.
Just to elaborate on what Sash said about the social anxiety, I think it is a natural feeling, especially when you are approaching a professor or someone, that you're feeling uncomfortable and, oh, what are they going to say in the email back to me? And the only way, to me, I've always just had in my mind, like, if I don't do it, then I will never know, you know, like, so an example of which, so the one example is reaching out to Paul and him responding and saying he would supervise me, where it was incredibly beneficial to do that. Another example was a few years ago, while I was finishing my master's, I saw a neuromarketing company that looked really interesting, and they basically integrated a lot of the research skills that I developed with my master's, and I wanted a bit of a break from academia. So I thought, well, let me reach out to them and just see, you know, maybe they need extra help. And so I emailed the CEO of the company. I was like, you know, I'm not going to mess around. I'm going to email the CEO. I was like, email the CEO. And I was like, I like what you're doing. I'd love to be part of your research. And he responded, and I was like, can we meet for coffee? And he was like, okay. We met for coffee. And I got the job. Like, he found something for me to do there, and I got promoted. And at some stage, you know, then I ended up working with Matt, who Saba knows, and he mentored me a lot and taught me about EEG and ERP, brain imaging methods, and eye tracking devices, and I learned a great deal from him. And him and I are friends now, and I emailed him this week. He helped me with my with this ethics application we're working on with Saba and Kate, and he helped, you know, promote that I have experience with that. And so if I hadn't have, you know, sent that email, I wouldn't have, you know, benefited. I wouldn't have a PhD in anatomy. I wouldn't have experience with, you know, those types of methods as well. Yeah, thanks.
That's so inspiring. Just ask them out for a cup of coffee. Why not? It's great. It's great. Busi, did you have something to add to that?
Yes. You know, the question on anxiety is such an important one. I can so relate. And the anxiety is not just about, it doesn't only stop us from kind of introducing ourselves to people, but sometimes even just submitting a proposal somewhere, you know, you just kind of feel like, but who am I, you know, to get this over and above all those experts that have been invited, everybody that I'll compete with. But, you know, sometimes you do submit a proposal and you actually are the chosen one, you do get awarded what you were looking for. And sometimes it's a bit of a surprise, like really nobody, nobody did better, but it's nice. It's kind of like, proof to yourself that you are capable. I would say just on a practical level, maybe have a generic email. Like there are a couple of things that I've wanted to ask people and I felt a little bit nervous. So I will have like a generic email and I'll have someone else, like a mentor, look at the email and see, if I was looking for an introduction or I want someone to maybe kind of work with me, collaborate with me, would this email kind of work, and every time that you are going to send that email, you then don't have to muster up the courage to, draft an email again, and send it to a new person. You can have it generic and just change the names, dear professor, put that specific person's name on, maybe a different date and send it off. And really the worst thing that can happen is that they don't respond or the answer is no, but you've lost absolutely nothing. I mean, an email costs nothing. And I was just thinking of an example, just listening to Vicky as well, that once I was back in South Africa and obviously now working on autism neuroscience, I obviously don't have a brain bank. I don't have human tissues in my autism collection. For now, I have a collection of animal brains where I've induced autism. So I really, really want to work on humans. That's really the gold standard for me. And it's taken so long just to ask, some colleagues who have brain banks in the US to give me work. I have lots and lots of ideas. I have lots and lots of things that I can propose, really exciting things. But because of that anxiety, I just haven't asked, And so recently, I guess, I don't know what pushed me that day, but I just decided to write an email and say, hello and whatever. And I said, what proposals would you need from me? Would you like a proposal? Can I propose some things? Can you share some brain material? This is really a big deal. I'm asking for human brains here, And I was thinking it's going to be a good 3 years of applying for this thing and begging, I got an email 5 minutes later saying, oh, when do you want the brains? What permits do you need to ship them into South Africa? Literally in that space of 5 minutes, I kicked myself so hard because I could have had the brains here already if I just done this 12 months ago. I could be working on the human brains already, but I stood in my own way. Sometimes it's just about, just get out of your own way. Because whether you believe it or not, you are capable, and I think the audience in this in this webinar are a specific type of people. This is not being broadcast for free. Just I think everybody already who made it in here does have that interest and is inspired, and does aspire to this. And I think already that says a lot about people who are here. So yeah, sometimes just get out of your own way.
This is such good advice. I'm also internalizing it. I think at every level we suffer from the social anxiety, and I love that. You'll never know when you're going to be the chosen one. So when your proposal is going to be accepted, or when you'll get a reply from that famous neuroscientist that you always wanted to know or work with. So put yourself out there. Some nice practical advice of having draft emails ready. Remember to introduce yourself as well in the emails, to address them as professor, have a nice little goodbye greeting. And I can't believe how fast time is moving. So I actually had a few individual questions I wanted to ask the panelists. I hope we get through all of them because we don't want to keep you more than over 4:15. But if any of the participants have any more questions, there's been some questions in the chat, please feel free to post them. We'd love to hear from you as well. But I was hoping I could ask Amelie a question about her experience in working in South Africa. So it's really inspiring actually to see really established researchers from France and from the UK working with South African neuroscientists. And what would you say really makes South African neuroscience stand out? What makes it unique and has made you want to collaborate with South African neuroscientists?
I think it's a very good question. I think now I have collaboration a bit everywhere, but really in South Africa, I think my main collaboration is there because people have skills and they're also very friendly. And most of my colleagues from South Africa, they're friends now. And also people are really open to collaborate. And I think that really makes the difference. And I really enjoy, you know, when I work there, it's not, of course, it's my job, but I also enjoy so much. It's more like you're meeting friends and we speak about research. And I think that that's really also probably why, especially in my field, so in paleoanthropology and human evolution, South Africa is a like very important place and plays a very important role in research. And it's amazing because it's not only because of the fossils there and all the resources, but also because people, yeah, they have skills. They like travel everywhere and they collaborate with everyone. I think it's really, yeah, something I really enjoyed in South Africa. And even now I must admit, or it's recorded, but I can say it, I miss South Africa. So it's great to be back in Europe, but I think it was really stimulating when I was doing my research there. And I don't know, it's a different context. And I think it's also for students, like going to BITS or UJ or Pretoria, you have like everything you need to be a like very well-known researcher in the future. So yeah, I think it's just great. I'm really lucky to have the opportunity to go in South Africa. And speaking about when we spoke about social anxiety, so I'm a very shy person. So I'm really happy that at some point I just decided I will apply to do postdoc in South Africa, just like this, like it was trying, and it worked. And then since then my life changed completely. So it's sometimes just, you know, we just need to wake up and say, okay, today I'm going to do that. I'm not sure about what is going to happen, but let's do it.
I think that's so amazing to hear from me, and I'm sure from everyone else, to hear about the potential that South African researchers and students can actually offer the neurosciences, right? You often feel that, oh, we're so far behind, or we can't make a contribution. So it's really nice to hear that, you know, we really do have the expertise and the training and the universities to be able to do like really good research. And many of these teachers and researchers are actually on the panel today. So and we can't wait to welcome you back, Emily, when we can travel again. It'd be nice to have you back in South Africa. So I guess following up from that question as well, this one's for you, Nafisa, is you know, based on your experience in neuroscience and teaching and being a practitioner and researching all things related to neuropsychology and neuroscience for the last 20 years, what has really been your experience of the changing landscape for neuropsychology and for neuroscience in South Africa over the last couple of decades?
Thanks, Sabah. That's a very loaded question. I think in terms of, if we look at it from a practical point of view, in terms of the career path, and I speak to neuropsychology specifically, I think it's changing, considering that the neuropsychology is now an accepted registration category. So the career path towards neuropsychology is more clear-cut compared to in the past. However, having said that, because it's such a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary science, and there's so many resources out there, I would always encourage students to continue to explore all these other avenues, because all of them eventually come together in the broad sense of what we consider neuroscience or clinical neuroscience. In terms of research, there's huge potential in neuroscience in general and in neuropsychology, and we do have a very multicultural population that we have much research to do on. And I speak specifically to, for example, assessments, neuropsychological assessments. There's a whole field of research that's open to potential students for applicability of assessments in this country. So those are some of the things, and I would encourage any student who is interested in neuroscience and in neuropsychology in general, that there's avenues for research, there's avenues to practice in neuropsychology. And I think with neuropsychology being a category now, there'll be more opportunities at universities for studying neuropsychology.
That's a great answer. It was a loaded question, but it was a great answer. And to follow from what Nafisa's just shared, Shona, from part one of the series, it didn't come up as much in this session, but there's a lot of interest in, could I say, applied or clinical neuroscience, including neuropsychology. And maybe this is because it offers like a fixed job or job stability, but or it's something that we're used to thinking, in terms of at least psychology students, these more applied areas of the neurosciences. But also from experience, we know that it's not as glamorous as everyone thinks. It can be very difficult to work clinically, even if it sometimes is job security. Could you just tell us a little bit more about the advantages and the disadvantages of working in a clinical capacity as a clinical psychologist and a neuropsychologist, or in more general in clinical neuroscience?
Yes, so it's not always very glamorous. I have worked in so I obviously went to VIT, so then the hospital circuit that I've been working on for the last 8 years has been Barra, Joburg Gen, Helen Joseph, the community clinics, Rahima Musa, and then I was permanently based at Tara for 6 years. And I started out working as a clinical psychologist because we didn't have the register at that time for neuropsychology. And then as kind of my progression through internship and then community service landed me at Tara, setting up a neuropsychiatric clinic. And I think, the biggest difficulty, and it is, if you do study psychology, you do get a paid internship and a paid year of community service. So in terms of job security, it's well paid and, you get very, very good experience. But it's very, very difficult to work in the government sector for a number of reasons. And I think the most glaringly obvious one is lack of resources. So to go to visit the University of Bangor in Wales, and I was so blown away by their infrastructure for neuropsychology that it was just unbelievable. But they were so blown away by our knowledge about neuropsychology in South Africa because of the patient populations that we see. So we really are at the cutting edge of some of the most incredible research because we have the patients. We have such, especially the HIV research is just absolutely unbelievable. The dementia research. We have a lot of traumatic brain injury in South Africa. In fact, one of the highest highest numbers in the world. And so we have so much to learn, and yet we are so constrained by issues with resources and access to different types of I suppose, even to do at the moment, just to have access to things like MRI machines for research, and things like we're not often able to do the things that we want to do with the resources that we do have. And then also, in the last few years, so in the last 2 years, neuropsychology has become a lot more recognized, but prior to that, it wasn't. So kind of trying to work in psychology, but then get into sort of a more neuropsychology thinking space in clinical multidisciplinary teams has been really challenging, even though it's been useful in the sense that it bridges, specifically at Tara, I was working in psychiatry there, but specifically between the psychiatrist and psychologist, neuropsychiatrist about therapy to sort of put those things together. And I think that's why in the last couple of years it's become a very exciting space to work in, but really difficult in the sense that we aren't able to necessarily do what we read about or what we would like to do. We have to be very creative, and I'm grateful for that experience because we have had to be very creative. We've had to try and do things with assessment and rehabilitation with very little resources and being quite constrained. And then also, the nature of working in very sort of low resource population groups where you can't set up interventions that you would like to because people don't have access to computers or people don't have access to internet. I think
that's great. No, it's
what I'll
really
say for
interesting
now.
to hear. Yes, it's again. No, thank you, Joan. I didn't want to cut you off. It's very also very much related to what Emily was also sharing, that we have so much to contribute. We have so much to contribute to the world in terms of neuroscience knowledge, and even with some limited resources, we can still do a lot. We do a lot clinically, and the same for research. And our techniques and things are just ever improving. So hopefully over the years, we'll just reach higher and higher levels of capacity. But thank you, Shoda. That was really insightful, especially for those that had all the clinical questions in the part 1 of the webinar series. So, Busi, a question for you, if I may. So a lot of us are really driven, either consciously or unconsciously, if we know it or not. Our research is often driven by our personal experiences. It's what motivates us, it's what drives us. And I found it really, really powerful and brave that even in your kind of abstract in your introduction, that you shared that your interest in autism also stemmed from having an autistic child. And I was also just really interested to hear the kind of challenges you've had in working, if it's in your research or even in establishing this NGO, with the stereotypes that we might have in South Africa about neurodevelopmental disorders, and how we really understand things like these complex syndromes like autism.
Hi, Saba. I think I just lost your sound bite for a second. Can you ask the question? I heard your background, but not the question.
I'm sorry. Can you guys hear me okay?
I can now, yes. I can now.
All right. So my question was, a lot of us are really driven by our personal experiences and what we study. If we know it or not, it's there. Sometimes you only realize later that this is why you're doing the certain area of research. And I thought it was really brave and amazing that you shared so openly that your interest in autism actually stemmed from having an autistic child. And in thinking of autism research in South Africa, as well as your NGO, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the stereotypes that that people might have, especially in the South African context, with neurodevelopmental syndromes, in particular, these complex syndromes like autism, that are not really well known, that people might struggle to understand, and how you've how you've dealt with that in both your NGO work and in your research.
Okay, yeah, it is very challenging. It's been very challenging. I think obviously the older he gets, the more experience I have, parenting him. I'd never met an autistic person before I met this person. So I am getting more and more experience, but he was born in South Africa, and for the first few years of his life, grew up in South Africa. So I only knew our challenges in South Africa, and I knew, what kind of things, what kind of interventions I would have really liked to be available for us in South Africa. But what really ignited a fire in me, actually, the reason the NGO was started is because we then moved and lived abroad for a year, and then we came back. So I got to experience, being an autism mom in South Africa versus being an autism mom in California. And it was like night and day. Just our experience in California, I always say it's very hard for me to describe it. It almost felt like the community where we were in California was softer. And I didn't know how harsh life was in South Africa until we actually were not living in South Africa anymore. I mean, I knew it was very challenging, but I was kind of used to the challenges, just used to, just really experiencing a lot of judgment, a lot of being questioned, even your intelligence is questioned, and your competency as a parent is questioned. And there's even along sexist lines, where there was a time that one beautiful September day, we went to a country club, and a man actually went to try and hit my child because he thought that, obviously I'm not managing the discipline well enough. And he went to hit him. Fortunately, he did not actually make contact, and my son was not traumatized by that. But I was, to put it mildly, livid, and he had to be driven away because I was literally about to take him down. That's the kind of experience that unfortunately I've had. And it's not only me, this is a very usual experience. When you speak to other autism parents, they'll tell you these stories. I mean, even more harrowing ones, you know? So it's very harsh, and we are used to kind of comforting each other. You know, another mom might be going through this on Wednesday, it'll be my turn on Sunday. So we kind of just, you know, comfort each other. It's really hard. What was so inspiring about being in California was that the community where we lived was host to this institute where I worked, where they work on autism. And they work, yes, on brains in the lab on autism, but they also work on the community, which is why then the NGO had to come in for me here, is that they reach out to the community, and they have clearly educated that community about autism and about neurodevelopmental disorders. And so when you live in that community, you don't even need to know how to read to understand what is autism, to understand what to do and what not to do, you know, what is helpful and what is not helpful. So I had experiences over there where, I mean, in contrast to this country club visit, I had experiences where, you know, my son would be sometimes overly stimulated. You know, sometimes he hears very acutely, and it doesn't really make sense to me, but I think just certain sounds are just too loud for him and things like that. And of course, I'm not experiencing the same thing, so I may not know what is happening. So he would just, you know, communicate it by having a meltdown. So a typical thing that would happen over there in California is that somebody would actually approach to help rather than judge. So they will, you know, approach and say, so for example, my son really loves spray bottles. So when we go into the shop, he wants to push the cart and push it straight to the place where there's bottles, you know, aerosol, whatever, you know, and he just wants to stay there. And even if we're there for food, we need to stay there the whole time. So people will come and they will say, can I have your list? They will literally take my shopping list and they'll go do my shopping while I entertain him at the sprays, you know, and they'll go actually get all the items that I need, put them in a cart, and then, you know, we can try and kind of, you know, nudge him out of the store, get him a sweetie or something to bribe him out of the store. It was such a different experience. And I want South African parents to have that experience where when they interface with the community, it's not that harsh experience anymore, where our neighbors in our community actually become allies, you know, and they actually become helpers rather than, you know, because actually sometimes the most difficult thing in public for an autism parent is not the autistic child, it's the adults. It's not even the children, the strange children, it's the strange adults. It's really crazy, but that's just how it is. And our biggest battle then becomes, you know, just managing the adults and managing their expectations and their judgment, and also managing our own emotions. It's really painful, you know, to be judged and to have your child judged like that, you know. So it just becomes really a lot, and you just end up taking your attention away from your child. A lot of us and a lot of parents who have just got the you know, the diagnosis, and when we meet them, it just happens that inevitably I'm always introduced to just another parent who just got the diagnosis last week or last month or whatever. And you know, one of the first things we teach them is, okay, you have to grow a very thick skin, okay? Because the most important thing, your biggest priority in whatever public scenario you're in, is your child. You just take care of your child. It doesn't matter what people think. If they think this is the most horrible, you know, misbehavior incident they've ever seen, they'll get over themselves. You know, they're grown. You take care of your child. And so don't get tempted to shout at your child, to yank your child, to abuse your child, you know, in any way, just to satisfy the adults that are very judgmental. So that's pretty much it's really the goal. We do so many things, but that's the bottom line goal of this NGO, is to just try and teach this community that first of all, you know, autistic children are children, they're not patients. And, you know, they deserve a life, and they deserve dignity, and they deserve respect, just like any other person deserves the very same things, you know. And rather than judge, please rather walk away, you know, walk away rather than judge or stare or question the parent, because the parent has enough, you know, in her or his hands already, without having to manage your judgment and your whatever you're thinking at that time and your emotions and so on. Yeah, so that's really the biggest thing for me that I learned, and that's what actually pushes the work of the NGO.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing so openly, Bhuti. I think two things that really come out of this for me is, one is, don't be shy to bring yourself into your research and your own experiences. We always try to be objective scientists, but we're not, we're subjective beings. So use that kind of these experiences to inform our research, and also how important it is to engage with the community, to make what we do in our science accessible to the community, right? And to bring practical change. That's also a really big part of the job, you know, to not just to publish and to have a high impact, but to then go back to the populations you're working with, the patients you're working with, to the communities you're working with, for them to understand the brain, disorders of the brain, you know, or the healthy brain, because so many aspects of the brain influence us in our communities. So it's really, really powerful to hear that personal experience. Thank you for sharing, Busi.
Absolutely. Just add one more thing, please.
Yeah, of course.
Just a little note about why the research must interface with the community is that if I'm going to have a brain bank one day, if the University of South Africa is going to have a brain bank with autistic brains, somebody's going to have to donate those brains. They're not going to come from outer space. So I have no choice. I have to, whether it's through the NGO educating the community or myself, in whichever way, I need to get our community to be more participant, see themselves as participants in research. And the more they participate in research while they're alive, the more people are more likely, you know, to not be so suspicious of research and more likely then to donate tissue. And if we're going to have this facility, it's going to have to be from conversations with the community. So yeah, thank you.
And we will have this facility. We will. Thank you for that, Busi. So Vicky, I know we're out of time, and I don't think there's any more questions from the participants, but I was hoping that Sash could end us off. I had another question for you, Sash, around the interdisciplinary nature of your research, but since this is the final question, I actually thought if you could just share. I'm sure for many of us there were times that we just had enough, that we couldn't do this, that, you know, a PhD was just too much to think about, or, you know, it was too difficult to find a job in the neurosciences, and we just wanted to give up in having a career in the neurosciences. And you didn't give up. You're now an established early emerging researcher. So is there an experience that you could share with us of how you kind of got through these hardships and kind of made it in the field? Or even any kind of closing advice for our participants today?
Okay, so in terms of making it through, I have found that with research, you have constant obstacles. One of which happened recently with COVID. I recently got my PhD. So with COVID last year, we couldn't go into the labs and we couldn't finish off the last bit of analysis that we had just to hand in. And thanks to my supervisor, we got through that. But the one thing you need to do is just be persistent. Persistence and determination is what's going to get you through this all the time. No matter what you're faced with, no matter what COVID throws at you right now, there will always be some kind of avenue out. That's the best thing about research, because there are so many different ways you can approach different topics and different avenues that you can go towards to getting it. It's not just one track. You can always find a way around a situation, because not only are you there through like multidisciplinary ways, like a lot of us here on this panel started off in a completely different direction to where we actually ended up. So along that way, you meet a lot of different people and you learn a lot of different tricks that you can use in your research and to move on with things. So just stay fast. Don't ever give up. There's always an avenue for you to go through to get to your goal at the end of the day.
Perfect closing remarks. Thank you, Sash. I'm gonna ask if that's okay. Could all the panelists just put on their videos just so we can, before we end, if that's all right. Just to say again, a really big thank you to Vicky for bringing us all together over both of these sessions. This has been so inspirational to me, and I'm sure to all of the participants. And thank you to every single one of our panelists for sharing so openly and passionately about your research. And you can just, if you follow in the chat, there's just so much positive feedback from the participants, and there'll also be a recording of this, so I'm sure even more people will hear your stories and be inspired by you moving forward. So thank you, and happy late Women's Day to everyone as well.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much, Vicky, for doing this. It's been awesome.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Saba.
Of course. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.